Hello, my quilting friends. Leah Day here with the last block for the Machine Quilting Block Party. We're going to learn how to piece a basic Dresden plate together and finish off our beautiful flower festival quilt with a very simple design. So let's get started learning how to piece this step by step together. To get started with this Dresden plate, you're going to need to cut out your petal shapes, and we're going to need 4 fabric C and 4 fabric B. So use the template included in your pattern to cut those out. If you want, you can also use template number 2 from the Dresden plate template set to cut out these petals. And the cool thing about these templates is you can also use them for ruler foot quilting. We'll be using that a little bit later in this block, so that'll be really fun. So another thing that you're going to need from the pattern is the turning template. And I went ahead and print this out onto freezer paper and then press another piece of freezer paper onto it. And that creates a nice stiff template. So it's easy to work with and it's going to hold up as we use it to turn all of the edges for these petals. So what I'm going to do is take this, and it's freezer paper side down, the waxy side down, and I'm lining this up on that petal on the back side of it, and I'm just going to press with a hot iron. So that's going to press in place, and the cool thing about freezer paper is the wax melts just ever so slightly and sticks to the fabric really nicely, and it's going to hold in place, but I'll be able to remove it really easily when I need to. So now I want to turn this edge, this extra bit of fabric here along this edge, and I want to fold it over using this turning template as kind of a sharp edge to help it crease in place. And I'm going to use a paintbrush and a little bit of liquid starch. I just sprayed some starch in this cap, and I'm going to paint it on the fabric. I want to paint it on the fabric and try not to get it onto the template because that's going to weaken the edge. And I'm only going to work about an inch, inch and a half, painting it on, and then folding it over and giving it a good press. And the reason I only want to do a little bit of it at a time, because it's going to touch that paper and the paper is going to start getting too wet, and then it won't form a nice rigid edge for us to turn that over. See how nice that looks? Now, a tip that I learned from my dad is to use a pair of tweezers like these, which can hang onto this and fold it over really nicely, and then you don't even get the iron anywhere close to your fingertips. You can just hold it in place, and it's not going to get too hot on your fingers. I've learned the hard way. Sometimes this technique, I end up with pretty toasty fingers at the end of the day. So now I'm going to paint on a little bit more starch, about an inch and a half or so along that edge. Grab my tweezers. And it helps just put the tip of the iron down on that applique so it doesn't move out of position, and then you can just gently pull up using the tweezers and then run the tip of your iron along that edge. That works great. So it's like it's putting little mini pleats all along that edge and folding it over. Don't worry about it being perfectly flat through this whole area because we're going to be trimming this down. It's no big deal. So now I'll finish it off, just a little bit more starch all the way to the tip, all the way to the edge of that curve. There we go. And there are other methods that you could use. You could apply fusible applique, like fusible web, and just cut it clean and then satin stitch the edge or zigzag stitch the edge instead if you don't want to bother turning it. I like the look of turned edges. I think they look nice, and you can see it really didn't take that much time to turn that shape nicely. Okay, so now that that is pressed, I'm going to give it one final press just to make sure it's nice and flat all the way along that edge and the fabric's completely dry. And then now I'm going to grab a pair of scissors and trim this down. So I've got a little bit of extra fabric here, and I'm just going to trim that down to about 1/4 of an inch past the fold. That looks good. Try and cut it cleanly, but it's probably not going to show through the Dresden plate, even if you do cut it kind of rough. There we go. Now I peeled off that freezer paper template. I'm going to lay it back down flat and give it one final press. So using the starch is really important because it gives you a nice firm crease. It holds it in place in shape, And don't worry, using starch in your quilt block is perfectly fine. It's going to wash out completely once the quilt is complete and we wash it, so absolutely don't worry about that. So use this technique to turn all of the petals for your Dresden plate, and I'll meet you back here as we start to piece them together. So I have 2 petals here stacked together. I'm just making sure those outer curved edges that we've turned are nicely lined up. I'm going to slip them underneath my foot and begin stitching. I'm going to take about 3 stitches on and then back stitch. And then once I get a needle in it, I'm taking a look at these bottom edges and making sure they're in nice alignment and that the fabrics are stacked up all the way together all along that edge. And then I'm just going to line up the edge of my 1/4 inch patchwork foot, and that's going to result in a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. So piece together all of your Dresden plate petals in sets of 2, and now let's learn how to cut them down so they're square and perfect to go together to make our Dresden plate. So now I'm just pressing open that seam allowance. I'm going to give it a good press with my iron, and now I'll flip it over and give these curves a press so they're nice and flat. So that's how we're going to piece the Dresden plate together in sets of 2 petals, just like this. Now let's trim this up to make a nice 90-degree angle so they all go together perfectly. So set this on my mat and put the ruler on top of it with the 45-degree line running through that seam line. And I've lined it up here so that it's really close to the outer edges, but I have just this little bit of extra extending on both sides. So I'm going to trim that up, and I'm using a rotating mat so I don't have to reposition the ruler. I can just rotate it around and trim off that other side too. So that little extra step, you know, it's just a bit of fuzz to trim off, but I like to do that because it just makes sure that this edge is a perfect 90-degree angle, and it's going to piece together with all of the other pieces just exactly right. So I've trimmed up all of my 1/4 Dresden plate shapes, and the next step is to piece them together in sets of 2, so you have half the plate created. And whenever I'm piecing these seams, I always start on the outside, back stitch, and then stitch into the inside. And the reason is that ensures that outside join is going to match up just exactly right. And you know, it really doesn't matter what happens here in the center because we're going to be covering that up with our center circle. So go on ahead and piece those together in sets of 2, and then piece those 2 halves together. Again, stitch from the outside to the inside on both seams. And I'll meet you back here when we're ready to put our plate on the background. So here's my Dresden plate. I put it all together and given those seam allowances a good press open, and now I'm going to place it on my block background. Now you can find instructions on piecing this background in your quilt pattern. It's very simple, just piece on the border and it's ready to go. And I folded this in half, lengthwise and widthwise, so I could create some creases, and that's going to help me line this up so it's arranged nicely on this background. So I'm lining it up so I have some seam lines along those crease lines. If you're making another Dresden plate for something else, you can also line it up like this, which looks really nice too. But for this block, we're going to go with this arrangement. So just make sure those crease lines are lined up with some seam lines, and then I'm going to smooth this out nice and flat. So you have a couple different options when it comes to securing this to your block background. We want to secure it in some way temporarily, so that way we can take it to the machine and machine stitch along this folded edge, or hand applique. You can hand applique that down too. And I have another video on that if you're curious about it. I like to glue this down, and it holds it in place securely but temporarily, and then after I do the stitching, after it's quilted, after we finish the block completely, then I can rinse that glue out. So if you don't want to use glue, you could also use safety pins, just pin this in place. You could also run a hand basting stitch around it. You just want the Dresden plate to be secured to the background of the block in some temporary way. I like glue because, because it holds it in place, but it's going to wash out completely. And I'm just using Elmer's glue that I put into this small glue bottle. And you can find this on my website. Just check for the link below the video. And so even though it's a small glue bottle with a fine tip, I'm really careful to only put on just a little bit along that edge. and I smooth it out and hit it with a hot, dry iron. And that's going to dry the glue really quickly. It's going to hold it in place. And I have used this for years in my quilts. I've never seen any problem from it. You know, it's like I said in the other Dresden plate video a while back, you know, kids eat this stuff. It's non-toxic. I don't think it's a problem to use it in our quilts. So I'm going to work all the way around, gluing down one petal at a time. And then I'm going to glue down that center circle. So give it a fold here in half, both ways, and that'll create some crease lines, and then you can center it up in the middle of your Dresden plate and glue that down just the exact same way. The final step to our Dresden plate is to secure down the edge of these appliques with some form of stitching. So you can hand applique this, as I said earlier, or you can do this by machine. It's a little bit faster. So I'm just doing a straight stitch, and as you can see, as I'm stitching, I'm carefully turning the block so I stay in nice alignment, just stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of that fold. And what I'm using is I have a little lip here within the foot that's allowing me to line up the edge of my Dresden plate petal, that curved edge, and that way I can maintain a nice consistent stitch from that edge. Now, an alternative would be an edge stitching foot, and that will work good too. I like using this foot because this is the foot mostly on my machine, and I'm lazy. I don't like to change feet, so that's why. But, you know, as you can see, I'm using blue thread, which is going to contrast pretty sharply on that green fabric. That's okay. I think so long as your stitching is neat and, you know, not jagged, I think it's going to look okay. I don't think it matters that sometimes it contrasts with your fabric color. Of course, these are pretty big petals, and if you wanted to, you could break thread with each petal and then switch thread colors so that way it matches, you know, blends in. That's definitely open to you and certainly an option if you really want the stitching to hide. So I'm going to continue stitching around these petals, just knocking that out, securing it down, and the center circle as well. And here's what it looks like whenever you finish our 12th Dresden plate. So that's it for this video. If you'd like to find the quilt pattern, definitely check it out at leahday.com/blockparty. I include not just the piecing and applique instructions, I also guide you through quilting the block as well. And I'll be sharing another video on how to quilt this coming up soon. So definitely check that out. If you have any questions about this piecing process, please post in the comments below. I really want to help you learn more about quilting. And if you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt!